Hello, hello, it's Mr. Grow. I'm coming to you live from my recording studio at an undisclosed location. I'm on my second pot of coffee and I'm ready to go. Let's light this candle. Today we're talking about Native American activism, a subject which quite frankly does not get enough attention in the general historiography. But before we get to that, it's time for a little bit of review. You're going to have to remember all the way back to, 8th grade, I think is when you guys probably talked about this stuff. We have the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the creation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1836. Then there's the Trail of Tears in 1838. The reservation system was created in 1851. And in and around these times, there is a tremendous amount of land loss going on. What with the Homestead Act and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, a lot of land was taken from the Native Americans under the guise of eminent domain, which is when the U.S. government basically commandeers land and pays what is determined to be market value. We could get into a whole discussion on the history of that policy, but for a different time. Then we have the Carlisle Indian School. That should sound familiar to you. You guys did a brief assignment on that towards the beginning of this year. Then there was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which gave the federal government permission to break up Indian lands. There was the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Native Americans were granted U.S. citizenship in 1924. And then there was the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. This was another step in the right direction, and it basically gave more autonomy, more agency to the tribal governments, and the federal government began to pull back on their influence. And then we have the Code Talkers, the Navajo Code Talkers in World War II. And again, those folks should sound familiar to you because we mentioned them in our video, one of the World War II videos that we did. After World War II, from 1953 to 1968, there was the termination policy, and this was a major step backwards. The government had several efforts during this time to eradicate tribes. In 1968, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded, and it focused on self-determination and tribal traditions. In 1969, there was the occupation of Alcatraz, a 19-month takeover of Alcatraz, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. And in 1972, there was the Trail of Broken Treaties. This was a march on Washington, D.C., to present a 20-point paper to the president, and we're going to talk about this more in detail in a little bit again. But that title is, of course, a reference to the Trail of Tears. So let's go back to that termination policy. A 1943 study showed horrible living conditions on reservations and extreme mismanagement by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The government came to the belief that tribes no longer needed protection for some reason. I'm not honestly sure why this study brought them to that conclusion. Regardless, it resulted in about 2.5 million acres of trust land that was no longer protected, and 12,000 Native Americans lost their tribal identities during the 50s. So let's take a look at an example of this in action with the House Concurrent Resolution 108 in 1953. It said that, quote, "At the earliest possible time, all of the Indian tribes and the individual members thereof located within the states of California, Florida, New York, and Texas should be freed from federal supervision and control all disabilities and limitations specifically applicable to Indians." Now, this is worded to make it sound like they're giving them more freedom, but the reality is much different. The Klamath of Oregon and the Menominee of Wisconsin were terminated, as well as many smaller tribes from the West Coast reservations. These tribes were ordered to distribute their land and properties to the members and dissolve their governments, and the federal benefits and services were terminated. In fact, over 100 tribes were terminated from federal assistance. The 1953 Public Law 280 allowed state governments to assume criminal and civil jurisdiction over Indian reservations in California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, Wisconsin, and the Territory of Alaska, because Alaska was not yet a state. But the states were not given rights to tax Indian lands. But I guess there is a bright side. It preserved hunting and fishing rights to tribal and federal protections. But I don't think that really, outweighs the termination of entire tribes. And it wasn't until 1970 that the policy of termination was officially ended by President Richard Nixon, although most of the federal termination activities had ceased by about 1958. Moving forward, we have the American Indian Movement, or AIM. The American Indian Movement was founded by grassroots activists in 1968 in Minnesota. At first, they wished to improve living conditions for Native Americans living in urban areas. They spoke against high unemployment, low-quality housing, poverty, and racism. Eventually, it grew into an international movement aimed at full restoration of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. The FBI and CIA have attempted to crush the movement during the early 70s, which led to a confrontation in Wounded Knee in 1973. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But right now, we're going to talk about the occupation of Alcatraz. So, on November 20th of 1969, 90 Native Americans landed at Alcatraz via wooden sailboat, and for the next 19 months, they occupied the island. But it's a little bit more than that, and it's actually a pretty sweet story. So, back in 1963, a woman named Belva Cottier, or it could be pronounced Cottier, have not heard it pronounced out loud, but it's spelled Cottier, so do with that what you will. Anyways, she was a Rosebud Sioux social worker living in the San Francisco Bay Area. She found out that Alcatraz was being shut down, and she got an idea. In the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, it stipulated that the Sioux could take surplus, they could claim surplus land owned by the federal government. Well, Alcatraz technically fit that definition. So, you see where this is going. They devised a plan to go and occupy it. And what's more is that, I have a smile on my face, this is pretty funny. They proposed to buy the island for the same price that the U.S. government offered them for their land way back when, which was 47 cents per acre. That means that they would have tried to buy Alcatraz for a whopping $9.40. And that was obviously to send a message, right? That is such an undervaluation of the land. And it's true. It's highlighting remember when I talked about eminent domain in the beginning of this video? This is a part of that argument, right? Eminent domain rarely pays what is fair for the cost, even more so when you're taking it from, say, a Native American tribe. So then fast forward back to 1969, and the actual occupation had started, and they continued to spit some sick burns and point out some actually really true problems. They said that Alcatraz was a more than suitable location for an Indian reservation as determined by the white man's own standards, in that it was isolated from modern facilities without adequate means of transportation. It has no fresh running water. It had inadequate sanitation facilities. There are no oil or mineral rights. There is no industry and so unemployment is very great. There are no health care facilities. The soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land does not support game. There are no educational facilities. The population has always exceeded the land base, and the population has always been held as prisoners and kept dependent upon others. And I mean, this is not funny because it actually is based on like the tragic circumstances that Native people have been dealing with throughout all of American history. But you just gotta respect how much they are just calling out the federal government's practices here. This is one of my favorite demonstrations. Unfortunately, though, at the end of this, the government basically conducted a siege on Alcatraz. They cut off water and power to the island, and you can only last for so long at that point. And eventually they had to just cut their losses and leave the island. But I would classify this as a success. It certainly raised a ton of awareness about some very important issues. Next up, we have the Trail of Broken Treaties. This was a 1972 March on Washington where protesters occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in order to draw attention to Indian rights. The protesters presented a 20-point paper that included restoration of constitutional treaty-making authority, commissions to renew treaty commitments and violations, resubmission of unratified treaties to Congress, mandatory relief against treaty violations, land reform and restoration, and 110 million acre native land base, repeal of state laws enacted under Public Law 280. Remember that was the termination policy. Abolition of Bureau of Indian Affairs by 1976, and protection of Indian religious freedom and cultural integrity. And you know what? None of this is unreasonable. It's unfortunate that they had to have a march to make these seemingly very logical, rational demands. And unfortunately, not all of them were met, but it did open the conversation to meeting some of these, and there were renewed talks about the treaty negotiations and things like that. Coming up next on our timeline, we have Wounded Knee in 1973, and it was seized by 200 Lakota in retaliation for the 1890 massacre. Resulted in a 71-day standoff, and all of these we're going to talk about in detail in just a second. Next up, we will have the Indian Self-Determination Act in 1975, and this granted semi-sovereignty to the tribes. In 1978, there was the Indian Religious Freedom Act, which protected the use and possession of sacred objects and freedom of worship. And in 1978, there was the Longest Walk. That was a march from California all the way to Washington, D.C. to protest anti-Indian legislation. So you can see, especially with the Indian Self-Determination Act and the Indian Religious Freedoms Act, some of those demands made in the Trail of Broken Tears are starting to get met, but not all of them. So in 1973, April of 1973, AIM, the folks responsible for the the Trail of Broken Treaties, organized a protest in South Dakota on the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. The desire was to bring global attention to the living conditions and generations of mistreatment from federal and local government agencies. This became a standoff between the 200 Lakota members and the U.S. Marshals and the FBI. The occupation was ended after 71 days by federal troops. And during that 71-day stretch, 2 Sioux men were shot to death by federal agents. So now let's talk about the Longest Walk, which happened 5 years later, on July 15th of 1978. On this day, a march across America had begun, with a few hundred people leaving Alcatraz Island in California, and ended up in Washington, D.C. with 30,000 people. They had marched to call attention to the ongoing problems Native Americans faced, as well as pieces of legislation making their way through Congress that would cancel treaty obligations. Since the original march, 4 additional ones have occurred in 2008, 2011, 2013, and 2016. And you know what? I have good news. None of the 11 bills that they were protesting actually got passed. So, it worked. It served its function. So now we need to talk about mascots and just imagery in general, because it is a big deal. According to the AIM website, last year, during the media hype that surrounded the baseball playoff games between New York and Cleveland, the New York Post, caught up in all the hype, covered its front page with the headline, quote, "Take the tribe and scalp 'em," end quote. Little concern was showed to the Indian children or community living in New York City or around the country. The American public has often been conditioned by sports industry, educational institutions, and the media to trivialize indigenous culture as common and harmless entertainment. On high school and college campuses, Native American students do not feel welcome if the school uses its mascot, or if the school uses as its mascot not a clown, a mythical creature, or an animal, a chief, which is the highest political position you can attain in our society. Using our last names, likeness, and religion as symbols to excite the crowd does not feel like the honor or respect. It's hurtful and confusing to our young people. To reduce the victims of genocide to reduce the victims of genocide to a mascot is unthinking at least, and immoral at worst. An educational institution's mission is to educate, not miseducate, and to alleviate the ignorance behind racist stereotypes, not perpetuate them, and to provide non-discriminatory environment for all its students conducive to learning. And this article makes an excellent point. It's not okay to boil down someone's culture into a caricature of itself. We see this happening all too often with, frankly, cultures that aren't European, and it's disgraceful. We saw it happen for a long time in American history with African Americans, Irish Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans, lots and lots of these groups. And it is a form of racism, even if the intention behind it is not inherently like malicious. It's still sending a bad message, right? It's still saying that your culture is nothing more than like a costume or a joke, and that's not okay. We can't do that to people. So there's other pressing current issues I would like to talk about as well. One being a lack of resources. 1 in 3 Native Americans are living in poverty. There's also poor living conditions. Many Native Americans are more likely to face homelessness. Education has been an issue as well. Only 17% of Native Americans continue their education after high school, compared to 60% of the overall U.S. population. Native American students also have a lower graduation rate. Violence is also a very big issue. 84% of Native women report having experienced violence. Violence also occurs against Two-Spirit, gender non-conforming people, at high levels. Many cases are not even reported, and local police forces are often too spread out, spread too thin to deal with all the cases. There are also voting rights violations. Some polling locations are too far from reservations, and traditional street addresses are not used. Both of these barriers are really serious. There's also an exploitation of resources. This leads to a lack of clean water and higher mortality rates, and it disrupts wildlife and fish populations and damages ancient and sacred sites. There's a, maybe I'll link it in Canvas, but there was a story last year. They wanted to use, actually it wasn't last year, it was within the last handful of years. They wanted to use that mountain on the west side of the 15 freeway near the Pechanga Casino, and that mountain, you'd recognize it if I showed you a picture. It's covered in granite. It is the site of the creation story for the Pechanga Indians, and they wanted to turn it into a gravel quarry. Luckily, that didn't happen. They were able to successfully fight off the granite company, but it's just another example of how Native American tribes are not respected enough. Again, there's a lack of health equity. Young people are 30% more likely to be obese than white counterparts, and adults are 50% more likely to have that same issue. Native Americans also suffer from mental health illnesses at alarming rates and have higher rates of suicide and struggle with substance abuse at higher rates. And all this is due to a lack of health resources and funding. There's also the problem of erasure and cultural exploitation. Often these Native American tribes are treated as ancient and no longer relevant cultures. This leads to a loss of language at alarming rates. And disrespectful uses of Native costumes, like those mascots, is also a big problem and a contributor to this. These photos are from the Navajo Nation, which is it takes up a lot of space in northeastern Arizona, a little bit of New Mexico, and I think the southern part of Utah, if I remember correctly. But there are some very serious poverty issues that the Navajo Nation is dealing with, and they're really not receiving the help that they need. This has been especially amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic because of that aforementioned lack of resources. There's only 222 hospital beds in the entire Navajo Nation, even less ICU beds. And as you can imagine, that's been a really big problem during the COVID pandemic. And that's why they have been disproportionately affected by coronavirus. It's a contributing factor to that. And finally, I want to let's try that again. And finally, I want to talk about Standing Rock, which was in 2016. On April 1st of 2016, tribal citizens of the Standing Rock Lakota Nation, along with other members of more than 200 tribes, created a spirit camp along the proposed route of the Dakota Access Pipeline. They wanted to raise awareness of the dangers associated with pipeline spills and stop the pipeline from being created. The protesters began with just a small amount of people and grew to thousands. And so the story to this one is still being written. As of now, I think they're either conducting an environmental review or they are about to conduct an environmental review on the Dakota Access Pipeline. What that will produce and where this will go moving forward is hard to say. But yeah, stay tuned. As we always like to say, history is still being written. So you're going to want to keep your eyes on this one. And that's it for this video. Sorry it was another 20-minute video. But there's just so much to talk about. And, you know, we are operating on this schedule where, unfortunately, we have to do only a day for some really big topics. So I hope you found this video interesting. There is a ton of really cool stories and some really tragic stories on top of that. And there are stories that are still being written. Native Americans are an enormous part of our history, and they deserve justice, equity, and equality, just like everybody else. That's it for this video. Bye!